All right, so I'll get started. Welcome to our online communication space today. We're really excited to share some important ideas with you and very grateful that you've taken some time out of your day to engage with us. We are representing the Forest Climate Working Group on this session, this planned session today, and we have some really wonderful speakers lined up. And so again, grateful for your time and really excited to share some information on these really compelling and important topics that are getting increasing attention and hoping to illuminate some of the key ideas here for you. To introduce everyone, my name is Lauren Cooper. I'm the director of the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University. And I'll be the moderator today, so I'll be assisting with some transitions between our speakers and facilitating a Q&A at the end. And we have some really great diverse speakers knowledgeable about a range of topics. We have Lynn Scarlett. She's the Chief External Affairs Officer at the Nature Conservancy. And here she influences climate and conservation policy in the United States and in the 72 countries and territories in which TNC operates. Formerly, she was the Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Department of the Interior, where she also served as the Acting Secretary of the Interior in 2006, when she initiated its first ever climate change task force. Lynn is the author or co-author of publications on climate change adaptation, ecosystem services, large landscape conservation, and science and decision making. Then we have Margaret, Regina, and Louise Hartman, and we are referring to our friends as the Hartman sisters, who co-own a chestnut farm. And Margaret Hartman is a retired pharmacist. Louise Hartman is a retired museum educator and a new graduate of Penn State's Forest Stewardship Program. And Jeannie, or Regina or Jeannie, Plasters is a retired Head Start teacher. So we're looking forward to learning from them today. We also have Eric Holst, who is Associate Vice President of the Working Lands Program for the Environmental Defense Fund, and he's also a forest ecologist. He works at the intersection of science and policy on both forestry and agricultural issues, and he's based in Northern California. And last but not least, we have Victoria Lockhart. She is a manager of ESG strategy for the Resource Management Service, which is a global timberland investment firm serving institutional investment clients, and has responsibilities for forest, carbon and climate, forest certification, conservation project development and valuation, and ESG and sustainability disclosures. And so thank you in advance for our guests today and for sharing their insight. Before we move on, I want to take sufficient time to introduce the Forest Climate Working Group. So if you're not familiar, the Forest Climate Working Group is the nation's only forest sector coalition working to advance state and federal policies that recognize forests and forestry and forest products as a central part of the climate solution. And this is, we have over 10 years of experience working together, and it's really grown to be an increasingly broad and diverse group, as you can see here. So we have a policy platform, a wide range of endorsers, very active in communication. We have everything from kind of intensive policy deep dives, but also a big emphasis on knowledge transfer, including a webinar series that if you're interested in continuing to learn more about these topics, welcome you to check that out and engage with us as we do deeper dives on many of the topics that are relevant for forests and climate. It's a very diverse space and a diverse range of interests involved here. So we're going to be touching on some of them in the session today, but I'm going to hand it over now to Lynn, who's going to give us a little background, a little context on the forest and climate intersection, why this is such a compelling and timely topic, why we're all here today and very passionate about these topics, and then we'll transition into the policy conversations. So I'll hand it over to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Lauren. So delighted to join everyone. Thank you for participating in this session. American forests are critical to the economy, public health, and environment, I think, as we all know, and climate change is exacerbating threats to forests such as megafires, pests, drought, and forests across all ownerships are both impacted by climate while also being a tremendously potential part of the solution to addressing climate change. Forests currently offset around 15% of our annual US emissions from fossil fuels, and we want to continue this. But this is increasingly challenging in the face of drought, wildfires, insects, disease, and pressures to convert forests to other uses. So in that context, forest restoration is essential. And there are three main ways to capture the full climate potential of forests while addressing management priorities. First, of course, is to protect existing stocks of carbon, particularly large stocks in public forests. But second, to maintain or enhance the ability of forests to continue to increase storage through improved forest management, reforestation, avoided conversion, reduced loss from pests and pathogens, and increased resilience through restoration. And then third, we can reduce emissions from major catastrophic wildfires by increasing the use of prescribed fire, resilient forestry to reduce fire risk, and through community engagement and collaboration. We can do more of all of those things with the right policies, tools, and supports. Strong policies and investments in forest resilience will help protect forests and address climate while also benefiting biodiversity, water security, public safety, and rural economies. Many forest-related climate solutions come from planting or reforestation and enhancing the management of existing forests. However, addressing climate through policies and practices cannot be done without underlying credible science. So I want to pause on that for a moment. How important forest inventory and analysis tools are. The forest inventory and analysis that we currently have has the potential to provide robust forest carbon stocks data and provide direction for enhancing such data collection. It's the only source of forest data and analysis that is national in scope and consistent in measurements. It provides critical information to federal and state forestry agencies, to industry, the academic community, conservation organizations on a whole wide range of forest-related topics. It provides the backbone of data informing economic decisions that drive billions of dollars in economic value in the forest sector. And those data help shape wildfire protection strategies. They help assess urban tree canopies, essential for air quality and heat reduction. The data are essential for wildlife habitat, and they help analyze actions and help support famous forest owners. They provide data on the state of the nation's largest carbon sink, our forests, making it an essential component of decisions regarding climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. Now, the demands for information on forest carbon are becoming more varied and at scales difficult to meet with the current design and capabilities of the program. So we recommend strengthening the forest inventory and analysis capabilities to a consistent nationwide cycle to improve carbon estimation and result in better policy application. We recommend robust federal investments in that system. But beyond investing in science and data, the importance of forests merits investment in reforestation, one of the most scalable and effective strategies for tackling many of the threats facing our natural world, including climate change. On public lands, maintaining and enhancing carbon stocks includes efforts that increase reforestation on federal lands and includes addressing the infrastructure needs associated with reforestation. Current spending gaps put an artificial limit on how much reforestation can improve air and water quality, protect habitats, expand outdoor recreation access, and combat climate change. So lifting the cap and making reforestation a priority for federal contracting will unlock this potential and improve the health, management, and sustainability of forests. The recently introduced bill in the House and Senate, the Replant Act, would lift the Reforestation Trust Fund cap to allow for more reforestation activities to occur, and we're pleased that it has really strong bipartisan support. Natural solutions such as forests can contribute significantly to addressing climate change, but they're just one piece of the larger climate puzzle. Those efforts with our forests must work, of course, in concert with other efforts, including transitioning to clean energy. So we need all hands on deck and all solutions to create a more sustainable and resilient future. So back to you, Lauren.
Thank you very much. This is really important background and context. Thank you so much, Lynn. And so with that, we'll slide over and we're going to hear from the Hartman sisters and look forward to getting some insight from them as landowners, decision makers about the importance of a landowner tax credit. So I'll hand it over to you now.
All right, thank you. I'm Louise. This is Margaret and my sister Jeannie. We're all going to give a short talk about this. We inherited our farm in 2000 following the death of my mother, and we inherited about 254 acres. About 150 of those acres is in forest. Now, this is an old farm. It was started in 1795 by a family called Sober, who immigrated here from Germany and purchased 700 acres. They developed that farm into, I think, possibly the world's largest chestnut plantation. And it was going great guns up until the 1920s. They would ship chestnuts all around the world, to Europe, all across the United States. They developed their own type of chestnut tree called the Paragon chestnut. But when the blight hit the American chestnut tree, they went bankrupt. Everything had to be cut, and they had over 800 acres in chestnut trees. So that all went away. Now, our grandfather purchased a portion of the original property in 1939, and he and the family lived on the property until about 1949, when my dad purchased a portion of that land. That's what we have. And we have many memories associated with that property. And I'll turn you over to Margaret now.
Hi. When we inherited the farm from our mother, we decided to keep it as a farm and not to split up the land. We have many childhood memories about the farm going down with my father from a very early age. He instilled in us a love of the land, the responsibility of land ownership, and our purpose was really to pass on the land and to maintain and pass it on. We were caretakers for the land. We would go down, we would walk through the woods, we would pick chestnuts, we rode horses through our woods, we swam, we kayaked, we really enjoyed our land, we gardened. We just really enjoyed going down there. In 2019, we attended a forest landowners conference at Penn State University. We learned about the Family Forest Carbon Program. 2020, we signed a contract with them. And I think this is our best hope of improving our farm forest. They provide some financial help, but the biggest benefit is to have the expertise we received from them. They've provided us with a 10-year plan to improve our forest. By following the best practices, we're going to improve our forest health. Our plan is to get rid of invasive species, to maintain and probably form new riparian barriers along our streams, to open up the forest canopy to allow new growth of desirable trees. And by doing this, we're going to help our quality of our trees. We're going to help the air quality, the water quality, and the soil quality, and helps increase the soil retention of water, lessen runoff. We will also improve wildlife habitat. We basically, by improving the quality of forest, we're going to really have a significant impact of our carbon retention in the trees and in the forest floor. The best 36%, I think, of the forest land in the U.S. is owned by family foresters. And this can have a large impact on our climate. Financial barriers really exist for many small forest owners. You don't get an immediate return by using carbon from a carbon program, but if you have financial help, you can help maintain your farm to eventually see a return for this. A tax incentive would go a long way to help us to help any kind of private landowner continue to improve their forest by replanting and storing carbon, by removing invasive species and improving your land.
Gina?
I was most impressed by the expertise of the people involved with the Family Forest Program when they came down to look at our land, how it helps with hardwood forest growth, carbon sequestration, air quality, and climate control. And these knowledges and practices, I think, is a great legacy to leave behind to my children and future generations to come. A tax incentive for carbon practices would be a great help for us and other future forest programs forest owners that would join the program. It would be great help in maintaining these practices to continue to grow a sustainable hardwood forest for generations to come.
I think we're done.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. I'll go back to our presentation. Very helpful to have your on the ground perspectives and obviously very rich relationship with the land and a strong sense of stewardship. So it's really interesting to see how carbon and climate topics are helping you to reach your goals. Now we will transition, and I should have mentioned we're actually going to save questions for the end, even though actually we did have one clarifying question. Hartman Sisters, do you mind, before we move on, do you mind clarifying where is your land located?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's in it's a little valley. It's called Irish Valley. Otherwise, I think it's known as Paxinus.
Paxinus,
Tiny.
Northumberland County, Pennsylvania.
Paxinus, Northumberland County in Pennsylvania. Sorry about that.
No, great. That's a beautiful area, and yeah, we're just curious about where you're located. So, so thank you so much for those insights. We're now going to transition over to Eric Holst, who's going to be providing some insight into a building tax credit and what that means from a carbon and climate perspective. Over for you, Eric.
Super. All right. Sound check, Lauren. Can you hear me?
There, yeah.
Great. Okay. That's a tough act to follow. Thanks, Hartman Sisters. I kind of want to just drop everything and go visit your forest, but
You're more than welcome to come.
hopefully we can arrange that. I'm now going to talk about tax policy, which compared to what you talked about is pretty boring. But I'm going to talk about this low carbon building tax credit. It's an idea that we think as a coalition will support many of the values that Lynn and the Hartman Sisters talked about. You're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is the sort of pyramid of life. The base of this pyramid are the kind of things that we sort of primary human needs that we all have: clean air, food, water, shelter. So these are things that, as the federal government is conceiving of new policies to combat climate change, we need to think about the base of that pyramid as something that, humans are going to take care of those needs no matter what. And, with a growing population, the intensity of meeting the needs for food, water, shelter are going to be more intense. And so we need to be thinking about how to optimize the production of those things. And in the case of shelter, we're talking about building homes, building businesses, other infrastructure that is critical. But we know that there's a carbon footprint associated with that sector. So about 40% of global emissions come from the building sector. Most of that is from buildings in use, and particularly the energy use associated with cooling and heating buildings. But about a quarter of that, so roughly 10, 11, 12% of global emissions comes from the construction of buildings. And so the sort of term of art associated with emissions from construction is called embodied carbon. So embodied carbon are those emissions associated with the materials and construction processes throughout the whole life cycle of a building. And this proposal that we're going to introduce to you today is a proposal to reduce the emissions from embodied carbon. And as I mentioned, it's about a quarter of the emissions from the building sector as a whole. So why do we think this is a good idea? One, let's think about the building industry in the US. It's about 4% of our GDP. It's one of the bigger, kind of single chunks. It's critical to our economy. something like 9 or 10 million jobs, depending on how you count it, in this sector. And so if we could enlist this big part of our GDP, big part of our job creation engine in the US in the climate solution, it's pretty powerful. And we think that the tax credit is a tool that's been proven. It's had the ability to stimulate economic activity and, importantly, to calibrate that activity to provide public benefit. So we think, that if enacted, this low carbon building tax credit that we're going to propose has the potential to enlist this sector and all those workers in this battle to combat climate change. This is also a sector that is particularly innovative at present in trying to tackle this climate challenge. So there's a lot of R&D, there's a lot of innovation, and particularly in the wood product sector. So many of you are familiar, and I think if you're seeing the screen, you're seeing on the right a commercial building, multi-story, being built mostly with wood. And this is a relatively a new sort of field. The building codes are becoming more aware of the fact that wood has properties that can be used in the construction of tall buildings, and so this alteration of building codes is leading to the innovation, the engineering, the technology, the development, and the innovation in the architectural industry is leading to a lot of new construction with wood. And so we think, combined with other low carbon building materials, that wood can be a great part of the solution. So what are we proposing? We are proposing a transferable federal tax credit for builders who build with a low carbon footprint and materials that provide that low carbon footprint. The amount of the tax credit will be determined by the full life cycle assessment. So life cycle assessment is this process of quantifying the GHG footprint of a particular building material. There's a lot of innovation in this and a lot of research and science going into the determination of these life cycle assessments. A lot of work yet to be done, but that's at the base of this tax credit is the life cycle assessment. So it will allow us to compare different building materials, and we think wood will compare favorably to other materials. Importantly, the life cycle assessment needs to be based on the best available science, publicly available data. It should be material agnostic. In other words, any material that the builder seeks to use can be entered into this process and compared against each other. So wood and steel and concrete would all be compared, and then the more favorable materials would be triggering this incentive. The transferable tax credit would go to the developer of the project or the entity within the projects that's making the most of the decisions about material use. Would be available for both commercial and residential use. So that's it. The details are in formation. Our coalition is working hard on this to kind of work out some of the technical details, but we're pretty excited about it. What's the impact of this policy? What would the impact of this policy be on the forest? I think we think wood is a material that provides a lot of climate benefit. Most of the wood that we use for construction in this country is produced in this country. So we think that a growing demand for low carbon, domestically and sustainably produced wood is a win for the climate. Importantly, we're not talking about wood only buildings. These are buildings and architects and engineers are going to spec out materials that provide the most benefit here. But again, we think wood compares favorably. And then finally, I want to say is, as Lauren mentioned, I'm based in Northern California, and we have sort of we've always had fire in California, but the new phenomenon is that the period from July to November is, basically smoke months, and that's driven by a new cycle of catastrophic wildfire that is being driven to some extent by management choices in the last 100 years, but also by climate change. I mentioned the innovation in wood technology. There's a big opportunity to sort of link low carbon building with wood to combating catastrophic wildfire and restoring a more natural fire regime in the West, and I think in other parts of the U.S. as well. So I think this low carbon tax credit could trigger a great deal of innovation that not only benefits the climate, but benefits land management and the air quality and the fire regime in the West. So look forward to talking more about this. Thanks. Back to you, Lauren.
Great, that is very helpful, and really, really important context in thinking about some of the innovative conversations that are occurring here about wood use and climate change mitigation. So it's really nice to see a more complex story presented here of what this looks like and how we interface with forests and thinking about climate change. So to transition to our last speaker here, we are going to hear, we're going to transition to Victoria Lockhart, who will be sharing some insights on conservation easements. And then we'll be having a nice Q&A discussion. So if you, I should have mentioned as well, if you have questions or comments, you're welcome to put them in the chat or the Q&A at now, and then we can maybe better address them and order them. So feel free to do that if anything's popping up, any responses, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. But right now I'll hand it over to Victoria.
Great, thanks so much, Lauren. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be with you on this Monday morning. This is such a topic that's close to my heart. I am a forester. I work for a timberland investment management organization, which, as Lauren mentioned, we take institutional capital from pension funds or from endowments, and we manage the forest on those owners' behalf. And conservation easements are an essential tool for us in being able to address not only carbon sequestration and storage out on the landscape, but as well the whole host of environmental and social values that flow from our forests. This morning, Lynn really framed out why it's important to look to forests, US forests in particular, for carbon and sequestration and climate change mitigation and adaptation solutions. The Hartman sisters gave us a wonderful insight into the importance of forests for families as well as for communities, and really framed up this idea of the multiple values that come from forests. And Eric has given us a wonderful introduction to the importance of the wood products supply chain in addressing climate change challenges, but also for linking back to forests and creating healthy markets that will enable us to protect and maintain forests out on our landscape. All of these strategies are about how we can do more in the forest and how we can produce products that all have climate benefits. And conservation easements are an important tool within that full toolbox that you've heard about today. Through conservation easements, we can protect forests, and we can also maintain and enhance forest sequestration and storage through permanent stewardship. And one of the most important things that I feel for conservation easements is that it's a built-in mechanism for collaborating across different stakeholder groups within the forest sector. So whether it's landowners who own and steward those forests, whether it's government agencies like NRCS, USDA, other maybe state and local agencies, and conservation groups. And we can all come together through the formal mechanism of a conservation easement to support those many values that come from the forest. Forest conservation easements are a proven tool for protecting working forests in the US. There are over 9.9 million acres in the US that are protected by state and local land trusts through conservation easements. And that figure doesn't include all of the easements that are out on the landscape through existing programs like Forest Legacy and Healthy Forest Reserve Program. As I mentioned, RMS, we use conservation easement as a way to permanently protect forest land. And we place easements on parcels that have critical wildlife habitat, that are critical for species protection, critical for water quality protection, as well as for community values. within all of those different reasons for conservation easements, we have the opportunity to address carbon storage and sequestration. And easements are important, particularly the sale of easements or the donation of easements, because they compensate the owners of those properties for the values that are produced from those forests for the benefit of society, whether it's the carbon benefit or the wildlife benefit. So the Forest Climate Working Group is making a proposal to enhance and expand the existing forest conservation easement programs. This is to keep forests as forests. Lynn spoke wonderfully about the importance of protecting the forests that we have. We also have the opportunity through conservation easements to be able to enhance the carbon sequestration and storage potential of those lands by creating a formal structure around which we can all have discussions about those benefits. So working forest conservation easements play a helpful role in encouraging discussions around forest carbon dynamics and for placing out on the landscape beneficial forest management practices in perpetuity. Our two existing forest conservation easement programs are the Forest Legacy Program and the Healthy Forest Reserve Program. Forest Legacy is administered by the U.S. Forest Service, and it's funded through the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The Healthy Forest Reserve Program is administered by NRCS, and it's funded through discretionary funding authorizations, but no dedicated funding. The Forest Climate Working Group is proposing a new forest conservation easement program, which will have a similar structure to the agricultural conservation easement program. There will be two elements to this program: the forest land easements and forest reserve easements. And forest land easements would be entity held easements like the agricultural conservation easement programs, ALE easements. And the forest reserve easements would be the successor to the Healthy Forest Reserve Program with NRCS easements and a restoration and cost sharing component. So thank you for the opportunity today. Looking forward to the questions. Really pleased to be able to highlight the role of conservation easements in supporting carbon sequestration and storage out on the landscape.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Really helpful context and very relevant specific policies to consider. We do have a couple of questions rolling in. And so we're going to kind of transition to a Q&A, and we want to also reiterate some of the key ideas here. Again, with the Forest Climate Working Groups, I want to remind folks that if you're interested in learning more, there's a lot of great documentation on the full policy platform of the Forest Climate Working Group, where you can read through some of the ideas that are presented here in just in a written format, which can be helpful to kind of connect the dots and to circle around on the topics that are most relevant for you. And so I'm going to switch us to a panelist mode here, and bring up some questions. So we have some that are rolling in, but I thought that maybe we could start out with maybe a bigger question. I think this is largely going to be focused to Lynn initially, but I'm happy to hear from anyone else as well. Lynn, just considering your really broad background and you're really experienced and have been involved in this conversation for a long time, can you speak a little bit to what you see changing in terms of relative importance of this topic, and where do you think we should be going, and how quickly should we be heading in this direction, and how integrated should this topic be? Could you just kind of tell us what's your big picture outlook with all the experience that you have?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lauren. Well, the answer to how fast is now, and as fast as possible. But, big picture, I think there's been a growing understanding that climate change is before us now, and that the effects of a changing climate are touching down everywhere and anywhere, including in the forest sector itself. And whether that's in exacerbated catastrophic wildland fire or the nature and extent of pests and so forth, these have always been with us, but the changing climate is exacerbating those effects. And so it really puts a point on, not only is our forests a part of the solution, because of course they naturally sequester carbon, but it's also important for the health of that sector and for the economic well-being of the communities and foresters who manage those forests, public and private. So the need is great. I think there's also a growing understanding of just exactly how important what we call at the Conservancy natural climate solutions are. So a lot of people have thought about climate as being all about energy, and yes, that's important, as are building materials and so forth, but soil, trees, the natural world around us naturally sequester carbon. And so as we lose those forests, for example, tropical forests in Brazil, or as we see the degradation of their condition, or as we see catastrophic and unnatural wildland fires, we see the loss of that natural capacity. And so as we heard the Hartman sisters say, their embrace of the stewardship of their lands to enhance the health of their forests can bring benefits, yes, to soil health, yes, to carbon sequestration, yes, to their community, yes, to water, and so many other things. So we have long known that, but we have now the science that can really put numbers to that. I'll just conclude by saying the Nature Conservancy did a global look at 20 different pathways of nature, everything from forests and forest restoration to wetlands restoration and so forth, and asked the question, hypothetically, how much emission reductions could those natural systems provide to our global climate goals? And hypothetically, it's upwards of, say, 30% of the emission reductions needed to be sort of on that pathway to holding temperature increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So super important. In the US, a little bit lower, we estimate about 20% of the solution set, but still that is big. And by the way, these are also very cost-effective solutions. So important to act now, lots of opportunity now, multiple benefits. You heard it from the Hartman sisters in climate, in water, in biodiversity, in livelihood, community well-being. So important to invest in this sector, public and private.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lynn. That's a really, really excellent overview and framing. And so we have kind of a range of some questions here. To get to maybe a clarification and some more detailed questions, I have a couple for you, Eric. We have one question here was if you could clarify the connection that you're seeing between addressing fire risk and supporting a bioeconomy, and maybe particularly talk about market limitations to address fire risk, or cost limitations to address fire risk, for example, and how market can change that dynamic.
Super. Yeah. Thanks, Lauren. So the connection that I was referencing would be to the utilization of residue from forest restoration activities or thinning. So in much of the West, we have a sort of misallocation of biomass in the forest. There's often too many sort of smaller fuels, ladder fuels or ground fuels that need to be removed in order to restore a natural fire regime. So for the most part, we're accomplishing this work at a pace that's far too slow to combat catastrophic wildfire. To increase the pace, it would be ideal to create some market utilization of that low grade or sort of smaller fiber. And so my hope, and this is a little bit more of a hope than a reality right now, is that this sort of wood products innovation could utilize some of that material for building products, which would then go, so some portion of that carbon stock would be removed from the forest and placed into long-lived buildings. So that technology is emerging. There's some products, Oriented Strand Board, for example, where some of that material can be utilized in regions that have the manufacturing capacity. The manufacturing capacity tends to be fairly narrow, and so expansion of that manufacturing capacity could have benefits for removing of thinning residue. There's probably a more immediate opportunity to utilize some of that fiber for the production of biofuel. It's a different topic. It's not on the agenda today, but just note that there's a lot of discussion about that, and particularly in California. The California Board of Forestry has a special initiative called the Joint Institute for Wood Products Innovation. And so if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend you go to their website and pull down the reports that they've produced. This institute, in partnership with the forestry school at UC Berkeley, has produced some really excellent sort of synthesis material. So that's the connection that I was referencing. I should say also that this sort of question of what to do with thinning residue or low-grade material from forests is applicable in the West and in the East. I'm sure the Hartman sisters are addressing, how to get the sort of species composition that you're trying to, create there in Pennsylvania. And a lot of that means taking out stuff that kind of came up, over the last 100 years that you need to remove. And so what do you do with that? Do you have to, just pay to haul that out of the forest, or is some market for that? So that's a big question that's relevant to forests throughout the U.S.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Eric. And just a quick follow-up question for you as well, Eric. We did get a question of, and I know that the building tax credit is still in conversation. And I should say, in case there's any confusion, I've promoted a few of our team members here that are really the policy experts, in case we need them to jump in with some specific responses. That's why we have some additional names here. But if you could just speak really briefly about what would the tax credit really look like? What are you thinking currently? How would it be administered? Who would the credits be transferred with the owner of the structure? Would they be simply on the building side of things? If you could just speak to your current thinking on that.
Yeah, that was really great foresight to promote Natalie and Alex potentially to answer that question. I mean, I think they're better placed to answer this sort of mechanics of that question.
Yeah, and I know that this is like something that's in conversation right now, but as Natalie or Alex want to chime in there, just a little more on what's your current thinking on how this tax credit would operate and who would be directly targeted?
Lauren, this is Alex. I'm trying to start my video here. Sorry. There we go. So I can speak to the landowner tax credit, and my understanding is with the building tax credit, the details on that are still being worked out in our working groups. With respect to the landowner tax credit, that would be something that would have two options. One would be where a landowner would have a couple of practices that were approved to receive a tax credit. So if they were new practices that were integrated into the way they're managing their forests, that those would be eligible to receive a tax credit that would potentially be transferable, so that even if it was greater than, if the differential in the tax burden of the landowner was greater in terms of how much they would be using, they would be able to sell or transfer that credit to someone else, another taxpayer. And then the other would be a performance-based credit that would be where you'd have a project or a baseline that a landowner established. And then for tons of carbon sequestered over that baseline, the credit would be awarded for that as well. And that would be something that would be administered between USDA and the IRS in terms of a tax credit structure.
Thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. And then just to remind folks, we do have some kind of descriptions of particularly that tax credit proposal on the Forest Climate Working Group website. So there's some more descriptions of those mechanics. And then please stand by as we're advancing in conversations on what the building tax credit would really look like, and we're engaged in some stakeholder conversations there.
And Lauren, I can say a word or two. So again, yeah, the details that need to be worked out. IRS is the grantor of the tax credit in this case, but the mechanics of calculating the climate benefit would be allocated to appropriate agencies within the federal government that have that expertise. So obviously, I think EPA would have some kind of central role in creating sort of standards for life cycle assessment, but there are other agencies and departments that would have expertise that would relate to specific types of building materials. So I think it would have to be some kind of a sort of model collaboration amongst agencies to agree on, the sort of the comparison mechanism, the life cycle assessment. And so in forests, we believe in particular that USDA has a strong role to play. The Department of Energy probably has expertise here, and other parts of the federal government. So, sometimes that's a little tricky to get that kind of cooperation across agencies, but because building materials come from different parts of the economy, I think it's going to be important to have some interagency collaboration.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, so thanks for that response. I'm going to transition now to a question for the Hartman sisters. If you don't mind, just, you gave a really excellent overview on your experience with this, thinking about carbon on your landscape, engaging with new programming. Could you just expand a little bit of how has thinking about, or this information about carbon changed your outlook for land management? Do you feel it's diversifying your options for income streams? And then also, like, maybe what was some barriers for you in terms of engaging on the carbon topic? Because I know that can be a concern for folks. And was that an issue for you to kind of get your mind wrapped around, like, what are we talking about here? Is this going to be beneficial to me? Yeah, just wondering if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Well, I think I've always known that trees sequester carbon and they store it in the forest floor. I didn't realize that all trees weren't equal. If it's a large tree, I just assumed it would do the same. But actually, there's quality of trees that really will suck up more carbon and lay more down on the forest floor. If you have a healthy forest floor, it will manage a lot of carbon, and it will actually help your ecosystem to thrive, because the carbon flows to other trees too, through mycorrhiza. I knew it did that, and I thought as long as we left our trees alone, it would be fine. But I didn't realize a lot of the intricacy in actually managing a forest. I really didn't. I thought the ferns are, I just didn't realize how many invasive species we have on our farm. I thought, oh, we're fine. Well, we aren't. And, the plan laid out what we have to do. And that was eye-opening to me. What else do I have to talk about? I forgot.
Well, I think for us, when we first looked at the plan, because it is a long-term contract, that was a little daunting, because you're thinking, what are we doing here? But once we started working with that group, they were wonderful. They were nothing short of wonderful. They helped us get such a greater understanding of how the forest works and what it needs and how it can help us, not just, some future point, but immediately. It really changed how we looked at a forest. It wasn't just that thing up on the hill that we occasionally might walk through where hunters wanted to go and hunt in. It really changed. It became something much more personal, and something that we really, I would say, have started to care a lot about. And well, Margie knows, when we're driving, I look around and go, oh my God, autumn olive.
We have problems. And
we have problems
that I wasn't even aware of. And we walked the woods with them last fall. And they pointed out a lot of things. Says, well, we need to do this, we need to do that. And, he said our woods were healthy, but it's, we really have to step up. We have to step up to the plate. We aren't,
And we could see where previous harvesting of timber had taken out the seed trees, which we had no idea. So
it was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. But now we're going to do a timber stand improvement cut this fall, all under good guidance, because it's one thing when you don't know something, but it's good to know that you don't know what you thought you knew. So
I just
it's
people have a very tunnel vision when it comes to some things, and I think we did in some sense. I remember my father refusing to cut down timber when a forester had come to him to sell it, and he got in a screaming match with the guy, and it was, he said, no, I'm not doing that. He said, there's no reason to.
Yeah.
He said, you want to cut down trees that have been there for hundreds of years. He said, I'm not letting them.
Yeah.
And it was a nasty fight in our house, actually. Verbal fight, I don't mean
Yeah.
physical, but my father just had more of an appreciation of what was
Yeah.
going on. And I didn't understand what he did. I really didn't.
Yeah.
But it's important you really have to be careful. You have to get expert help that doesn't have I guess,
Pure interest.
it doesn't have a monetary goal.
Yeah.
When they're trying to help you.
Yeah,
you
and
gotta be
also, I
careful.
mean, we've had, they wanted to put an oil pipeline through our property, and we said no to that. They wanted to do fracking exploration on our property. We said no to that.
But I think
But it wasn't because we had all this knowledge, other than with the oil pipeline, that's 100 feet off of either side of that pipeline. They're taking out a lot of trees. We didn't want that.
no, they just
Yeah.
you really need there's a lot going on, and I think if you don't have expert help, you're going to get lost. You can get lost in the details, and I think
Yeah.
it's important to start out with some things and just work your way through it. And I think it's very difficult for most people to do that. If you don't have a little financial help, and if you don't have an expert behind you, you really aren't going to do well. I don't think. I wouldn't. I know that.
Yeah.
Well, I think these are really helpful comments. I mean, and I think even generally outside of the carbon and climate conversation, but particularly, what we're seeing, and what I'd like to highlight here from what you're framing is it's really compelling how the carbon piece, is providing additional options for landowners in terms of
Yes.
alternative income streams, and just diversifying your options on your management or where you can get support. There's programs that are available or that need additional funding from at the federal level that can provide that the types of support that you need for forest management and information, and make sure that you feel confident and informed making those decisions. So thank you for sharing that insight with us. It's very important to hear. And I wanted to ask a question, transition over to, maybe this is mostly over to Victoria. Could you elaborate a little bit more about conservation easements in terms of their role in protecting land that's considered maybe working forests versus forests that have a strictly conservation goal? And how do you differentiate those strongly in your work, or is it a blurry line? How do you think about that? Because that does seem to be a point of confusion just generally about forests and climate. Like, should we be managing forests or should we not be managing forests? And are forest products okay, or should we just be planting all these trees? And it seems like that maybe your response to this could help us understand maybe why we have different values on different parcels of land, and different trade-offs and different reasons why we have those priorities.
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. So I think the Hartman sisters mentioned it perfectly, that there oftentimes are management activities and actions that are needed to keep our forests healthy. And forest conservation easements, I think when I sort of started out in forestry, there was a very strong distinction between easements that were just protection oriented. And I like to term those informally sort of no touch easements, where you're not enabled through the language of the conservation easement to be really active in your management of those parcels. And in some areas that's appropriate. There was this very strong distinction between that protection orientation and easements that were sort of working forest conservation easements, where active management is required through the easement and really supported in order to produce the conservation values that the easement has been put in place for. That distinction, I think, is becoming blurrier and blurrier, particularly when we think about carbon sequestration. There are management activities that are really key for maintaining strong sequestration through time, whether that's through kind of the active management of timber stands so that we're producing these beneficial climate forest products that are going into buildings, but also for changing our age class distribution to ensure that we have younger forests coming up that have a very strong sequestration sort of footprint, as well as supporting the older forests that continue to store large amounts of carbon through time. Working forest conservation easements, I'll share with you an example from RMS. We have a parcel in the panhandle of Florida that's part of our Coastal Headwaters Longleaf Restoration Initiative, where we have an easement that's held by NRCS, and there are actually very specific active forest management techniques that are required through time by that easement. They include prescribed burning for the health of the understory plant species so that we can support, it's over really 30 wildlife species of interest, conservation interests, including the gopher tortoise and all of the species that use its burrows, as well as the transition of loblolly pine plantations into longleaf pine plantations, which will provide strong carbon storage and sequestration potential through time. So those prescribed burning, as well as that active transition of loblolly pine to longleaf, is required by the easement. And for that reason, it's considered a working forest conservation easement. Lauren, just really briefly, you touched on this idea of different parcels of land, different parcels of forests having different values. And I think it's important to remember that there's not one solution that's going to be helpful for all landowner types and all forest types. Eric has touched on the importance of wildfire out west. The Hartman sisters have talked about invasive species, and I've talked quite a bit about sort of longleaf pine and supporting markets and working forests. And so you can see just from the conversation today that we need a whole toolbox, just not one tool, to really support forests through time and producing positive climate benefit.
That was a really great wrap up there of your thoughts. And we are on the hour, so that was really wonderful. I'm going to just share our last slide here because it's such a great lineup. So, just to reiterate that forests are complex. We have very, complex values for forests, complex challenges depending on where the forests are. And climate is unfortunately making some of those challenges more complicated. And so this active thinking about forests as a tool to address climate change, but also being vulnerable to climate change. So we need to think very actively about what's right and what are the best interventions. So with Forest Climate Working Group, we're promoting that forests are our most powerful tool that we have in our arsenal of land-based strategies to fight climate change. And so with that, we will wrap up. Very thankful to our speakers who shared all of their insight and expertise with us today. And also to everyone that joined us in the session. We do have some outstanding questions. Apologize that we could not get to all of them. But with that, we'll wrap up. This is recorded. You're welcome to reference the recording later on. And I want to thank you again for your time. Thanks to the speakers. I really enjoyed the session. Have a great afternoon, everybody.